Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is that you are watching this, and welcome to What's Left. I'm your host. My name is Larry Erickson, and for the next half hour, I'm going to be talking about something that I hope you'll find interesting. As always, if you have any reactions to the show, you can send them to me directly. This is my personal email here, whoviating@aol.com. Or you can go to my website, which is called Lotus Surviving a Dark Time, and the URL will be here during the show. You can go there, you can get the email address from there, or you can leave a comment there if you'd rather. But if you do send me email, as always, two requests: include something in the subject line that makes it clear this is not spam, and be a little patient about getting an answer. So with those generalities and frequencies out of the way, let's get to it. This is actually show number 19 of What's Left. But if I include the previous incarnation of the show, which was called Left Side of the Aisle, this is actually show number 280. More to the point, it's being recorded on April 20th, which, if memory and counting both serve, is 6 years to the day from when the very first episode of Left Side of the Aisle was recorded. We have been doing this for 6 years now. So this week is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to spend most of the show talking about something, I suppose you could call it more personal than I usually do. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't a great deal to talk about, even if we, as we Americans generally do, limit our focus to what we think is going to affect us in the short term, and the rest of the world be damned. And of course, of necessity, what we would have to talk about, especially within that narrowed focus, has to do a lot with Donald the Rump, as frankly probably would be true with pretty much any president. But in a truer, a more basic, that is in a more radical sense, what we have to talk about, what we have to address ultimately is, it's about Donald the Rump, but it's not. It's about the people around him, but it's not. It's about the people who supported and still support him, but it's not. It's about all of that, but it's not all about any part of that. It's about the well, the common source all of those people draw from. It's a well led by a vile undercurrent in our society. A vile undercurrent which the Rump, and say what you will about him, you have to admit one thing: he is a successful real estate salesman, which is something I've been saying from the very beginning, actually explains a lot about him. But this is a vile undercurrent that the Rump recognized and exploited for his own purposes. It is a vile undercurrent of bigotry, of hatred, of fear that runs through our society. A stream that over time has run stronger and has run weaker, but it has never run dry. An undercurrent of bigotry, of hatred, of fear, that contrary to what some establishment Democratic Party partisans will tell you, the Rump did not create. He couldn't have created. It's beyond his power to create this. What he did do, however, was he unleashed it. He unleashed it for his own selfish ends and for his own ego. With the tacit cooperation of our easily manipulated, sensation and headline-hungry media, he made it acceptable, more socially acceptable than it has been in decades, to be openly racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic. And he rode that tide of bigotry, hatred, and fear, and it proved to be big enough, just barely big enough, but big enough to get him into the White House. And once there, he surrounded himself by a cackling cabal of bigots and Il Duce wannabes who in their perverted little brains thought that they were the real voice of this nation, that they were the voice of our soul instead of what they actually are, which is the voice of our sickness. And he turned that cabal loose to pursue their fantasies. He unleashed the bigotry, the hatred, the fear that exists within his own administration. He unleashed their love of violence, their love of the military, their love of militarism, which means their love of force, of brutality, of power, of dominance, whether exercised by the military or by police. Unleash their xenophobia, their racism, their sexism, their hatred for modernity, their hatred for science, their hatred and fear of knowledge itself. So we've seen an expanded war in Syria, the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan, intensified drone attacks, war-driven famine in Yemen, produced by U.S.-supplied arms, thinly veiled threats to attack North Korea if it so much as tests a missile that we don't like, and far more. While domestically, we have seen the bigoted, xenophobic scumbag who holds up the Immigration Enforcement Agency declaring that his agency must not be criticized, even as they take every effort to sweep away anything that even hints of the other. We see plans to do away with established consent decrees and let racist and violent police forces go right back to being racist and violent. We see rights and protections stripped from everyone from women who just want health care, to women who just want a decent job, to people who just want to use the internet. All of that and far more, with the goal of making things the way that they used to be, but in fact never were, except for rich white men. I said a few weeks ago that I had never before in my life, in my memory, seen an administration so persistently indifferent to the needs of the many, both here and around the world, so insistently determined to comfort the comfortable and afflict the already afflicted, so unreservedly favoring the powerful over the powerless, the rich over the poor, the corporations over the people, so eager to embrace bigotry. This is the first time I've seen an administration so utterly devoid of redeeming virtues. So yes, there is a lot to talk about and much to do, but across all of our acts of resistance, we need to recall that ultimately, at bottom, at root, this cannot be about Donald the Rump or his co-conspirators or his blinkered minions. But it has to be about the well from which they drink, that well fed with that undercurrent of bigotry, hatred, and fear. At the end of the day, the rump and the rumpettes are the symptoms, the outgrowths. They are not the disease. And we should constantly remind ourselves that for a society just like a patient, it's sometimes necessary, as the present moment is necessary, to focus on the symptoms of a sickness. But we should never confuse the symptoms with the disease. And frankly, it's also true that sometimes for our own health, mental as well as physical, we have to step back from that for a moment. So frankly, I'm giving myself a week off. Except for one observation, just because I feel like it. 3 months ago, I argued that Russian interference in the U.S. election, which I was entirely prepared to accept happened, was not aimed at electing the rump, but at damaging Hillary Clinton so that she would be a weak president. Well, on April 19th, Reuters reported that a Russian think tank connected to Vladimir Putin developed a plan to affect the 2016 U.S. elections. Initially, it was aimed at building up the rump. But by October, they had decided that Clinton was likely to win the election and proposed then intensifying their messaging about voter fraud to undermine the electoral system's legitimacy and thereby damage and weaken Hillary Clinton as president. So the question is, who are you going to listen to? CNN and the Democratic Party establishment, or me? Let's take a break. And we're back. And okay, as I said, I'm going to spend the rest of the show now on that sort of more personal note, I suppose you could call it that. Knowing that only a very small number of you, again, we've been doing this for 6 years now, and only a very small number of you have seen the show from the beginning. In fact, only a very small number of you could possibly have seen the show from the beginning. I thought I'd take advantage of this anniversary to give myself a break from the worries of the world and spend the rest of the show introducing or maybe reintroducing myself so that the things that I say here can be put into a broader context of ethical, moral, and political convictions, which is something, frankly, I think every political commentator should do from time to time just for that reason. You have a context for the things that they say. See, I have several times described What's Left as an example of what's called advocacy journalism. This is the type of journalism that respects the journalistic standards of accuracy and the separation of fact and conclusion from fact from opinion, but nonetheless has a definite and clear point of view. It is journalism intended to inform and inspire, and by putting facts into an ethical context, spur action. That has been my goal with this show the entire time, from the very beginning. So to reintroduce myself, I'm going to start up by talking about a socio-psychological concept called worldview. Your worldview is your way of mentally organizing the world so that it makes sense. It's your way of putting order to what you perceive. We all have a worldview. And in fact, not just individuals, cultures have worldviews. In fact, one of the things that defines a culture is a shared worldview, a generally shared but often implicit understanding about the way things should be, about the way reality works. That worldview can be radically different from one culture to another, and within a culture it can change over time. As one example of that, our worldview here today is much different from the worldview of the earliest European settlers of North America in the 16th and 17th centuries. The point is, no matter what that particular worldview is, every culture has one. Without a shared worldview, a culture will fracture for lack of a bond to hold it together. The same holds true for individuals. You have a worldview. You need to have a worldview, as that it's very difficult to function without one. Without a worldview, everything is like chaos. Even something as seemingly basic and obvious as cause and effect reflects your worldview. Try to imagine functioning in the world around you with no sense of cause and effect. That will give you some sense of what it's like trying to operate without a worldview. Now, more important, though, to my immediate purpose here is that within that worldview, there is a more limited version of it which applies to your political, your moral, your ethical considerations. That worldview drives your sense of right and wrong, of proper and improper. It informs your sense of what should and shouldn't be. Now, for most people, forming that worldview is part of just growing up. It forms as part of you as you mature. Again, for most people, that worldview doesn't change much once it's formed. It can, but usually it usually doesn't, and even when it does change, it's usually not by much. Even things that can seem significant changes, like a change in political opinions, often enough are not changes in actual worldview. They are rather a change in the interpretation of events and experiences in light of that worldview. Your worldview is part of your basic psychological makeup, and that doesn't change easily once formed. Doesn't mean it can't, doesn't mean it never does, but it's pretty rare and it doesn't happen easily. So having said that, what I want to lay out is what I think are important elements of how I reach the final, we could call it mature version of my worldview. Perhaps the most important thing to say is that I am in many ways a child of the 60s, having come to political awareness during that brief and some would have it mythical interregnum, marked at one end by the Sgt. Pepper's Summer, or the Summer of Love you prefer, and the other by Altamont, or if you prefer a political description, by Flower Power and the Days of Rage. Now, for those of you who are less than about 55 and for who those terms don't mean anything, look them up. For now, it's enough to know we're talking about the period of roughly 1967 to 1970. Like most, at least male members of my generation, it was Vietnam, the Vietnam War, that initially drew me beyond vague concern into concrete involvement in political and social affairs, even for those of us safe with draft deferments. And that's another thing a lot of people today cannot relate to. The fact that there was a military draft under which you could be forced, under pain of fine and imprisonment, to join the army and go wherever they sent you, including into a war you thought criminal. This is something, the fact that a lot of people can't relate to this is something about which I'm very glad. But no matter, during the Vietnam era, even for those of us safe with draft deferments, who could feel confident, at least for now, you couldn't be drafted, the war was always there. It swirled around us like a fog, like a mist. It tugged at us like an undertow. It threaded in and out of our lives, our future plans, our consciousnesses, and you could only ignore it by making the conscious active choice to do so. In fact, I think those of what I'll call the Vietnam generation have a greater understanding of the impact that World War II had on our parents than those of what I'll call the Iraq generation have of the impact Vietnam had on us. Because no matter how you measure it, the Vietnam War, which actually should be called the Indochina War, because it ultimately involved Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, by any measure, it was a much bigger war than Iraq or Afghanistan ever were. For example, peak U.S. troop strength in Iraq was 168,000. And the year 2008, which was when there was the peak troop strength of U.S. forces in Iraq and Afghanistan combined, at that point it was 188,000. Peak U.S. troop strength in Vietnam was over 536,000, nearly 3 times as many. And by the way, South Vietnam, where most of those troops were stationed, is only about 40% the size of Iraq. U.S. troops killed in Iraq and Afghanistan combined up to April 18th of this year totaled just over 6,900. U.S. troops killed in the Indochina War totaled well over 58,000, well over 8 times as many. U.S. wounded in Iraq and Afghanistan combined reached around 50,000. Those wounded in Indochina were over 300,000, over 6 times as many. So yes, a much bigger war, significantly more troops, significantly more wounded, significantly more dead. And for those of us who questioned the war, who asked our government about the whens, the wherefores, the whys of this war, it seemed that each of the answers we got just raised 2 new questions. Now, politically, I had grown up in the mold of my parents, a mold that was at one time called a Humphrey, referring to Hubert Humphrey, a Humphrey Democrat. Type which I came to call a right-wing liberal, and which is now commonly called a liberal war hawk. This is a species of American political animal that it's at least relatively liberal on domestic affairs, but clearly conservative on foreign policy. A type whose philosophy I later summed up as hooray for justice, beauty, truth, and kill commies. My personal breaking point over the war came when I heard the man who was then the commander of the U.S. forces in the war, and frankly, I don't remember which one it was, but I heard the commander of U.S. forces in the war say, "We're winning the war, just give us 6 more months." And I recalled having heard exactly the same thing 6 months earlier. And I can still recall clearly thinking to myself, okay, I will give you your 6 months, but after that, you've lost me. And of course, the war didn't end in 6 months. It dragged on for year after year amid repeated promises that it really was already over. The term was and is increasing alienation, that kind of thing generated, plus mounting evidence of what the governments we supported in South Vietnam were really like, that is, brutal dictatorships, eventually prompted me to very shyly attend a meeting of a local peace group. That was, if memory serves, in the fall of 1968, and I still recall walking into this room in a church basement and being greeted by a tall man with a beard and a not inconsiderable resemblance to Abraham Lincoln. In fact, it was considerable enough that he later added a mustache because he was tired of the Lincoln jokes. His name, by the way, was Jack Caroly. All right, you can relax. It's over now. I have no intention of inflicting my entire autobiography on you. But knowing the roots of my involvement in the movement may help to some degree explain where I've wound up. I'm an aging hippie. I'm an educator. I'm a political activist, and the terms order of presentation depend upon circumstances and my mood of the moment. I'm also a democratic socialist green with an anarchist bent and a civil liberties absolutist who has, by both logical conclusion and moral compulsion, a commitment to active nonviolence, both as political tactic and way of life. The only isms I wholeheartedly endorse are skepticism and eclecticism, which actually raises the fact that I have sometimes flippantly described myself as a socialist, anarchist, mutualist, capitalist, eclecticist iconoclast. And when people's eyes stop glazing over, I explain. And then I'm a capitalist, and I believe in the mom pa store, the community-level enterprise, the small factory, the 2 or 3 store chain. I'm a communalist in that I believe that cooperative ventures are inherently better than competitive ones. I'm a socialist in that I believe that beyond a certain point, profit-making enterprises cannot be trusted to be responsible to the communities where they operate. And at that point, the community has both the responsibility and the authority to step in, make decisions up to and including taking outright ownership. Now, I'm an anarchist in the sense that I believe in doing that with as little government as you can get away with, and with individual freedom and civil liberties set at the maximum possible that is consistent with social justice. I'm an eclecticist, and I believe you can actually put all this together into some kind of reasonably coherent political philosophy. And I'm an iconoclast in that, well, you know that there's a line from the I Ching, the Chinese Book of Changes. The I Ching, the philosophy is the only thing that doesn't change is the fact that everything else changes. My version of that is the only ultimate answer is that there is no other ultimate answer. And if you ever did build a society along the lines that I envisioned, the first thing I would do is try to figure out what's wrong with that society and how that one could be made better. Now, in doing this show, I am guided always by 4 editorial principles. 1, to thine own self be true, which, as I'm sure you know, is a quote from Shakespeare. 2, the U.S. isn't the worst, but it is the biggest, and that's a quote from Joan Baez. 3, sometimes a bit of humor contains more inner truth than the most serious seriousness, which is a quote from a chess grandmaster named Aaron Nimzovich. And 4, no one but no one, no matter their ideology, political perspective, or status as left or right, can for that reason be exempt from either criticism or praise. And that's a quote from me. The bottom line point is that I have always believed that in any political movement, everyone has some skill they can use. Everyone has some skill or ability that they can contribute to advance the cause. Now, my list of inadequacies on any list of necessary skills is quite lengthy, but I do have some skill with words, with writing, with talking, giving speeches, and like that. So this show ultimately is just another way I think I can be of use, another way to try to advance the idea of justice, another idea to attempt to maintain the hope that is the only thing that keeps us going. It is, if you will, another light against the darkness, or if you remember the song, another candle in the rain. All right, that's enough about me. As for the show itself, there have been some changes in it over the time that it's been on. It actually, at first, at the very beginning, the show consisted of me standing in front of a plain gray background, rambling on about whatever I was rambling on about that week. After a time, though, in order to keep the camera crew from going insane trying to follow me as I wandered about the stage as I talked, we went to having me sit on a stool, and around that time we added graphics. But I was just more comfortable standing, so we set up a podium. And there I was, standing with my right hand on a podium, and still in front of that same gray background. But this made me happy because I was standing. It made the camera crew happy because I was standing in one place. And it made us happy because we could use the graphics. Then it got to be fun, where we were able to start using what's technically called chroma key, but is more popularly known as green screen. That is, we can replace the background with whatever image we want to put up. Sitting here in the studio, all that is behind me is a blank green wall. But through the magic of computers, we can replace that with whatever we want. So we had me, my podium, and graphics. What more could I ask? Then I blew out my knee so bad that I couldn't stand without crutches. So we started using this desk-style look while I recovered, which, yes, I did a long time ago. Thank you for asking. But after a few weeks, I decided I liked this look. So that's what we have for now. But don't be shocked if at some time in the future I wind up standing up again. Over the course of doing the show, we've developed various features. The 2 most popular and common ones are, of course, the Clown Award, given for meritorious stupidity. That was supposed to be an occasional feature, but there's been enough stupidity to keep it going. And, of course, the Outrage of the Week, because what would I do if I had nothing to be outraged about? We've also developed a fair number of occasional features, everything you need to know, the little thing, for the record, and the not regular but happily frequent feature, good news. And the thing is, I have been helped so much over these years, these 6 years, by several people, without who this simply would not have happened, and even if it did, would not have gone on as long as it has, and hopefully will. And so these folks have and do help me, and so I wanted to acknowledge them. First and foremost, my deepest thanks, of course, go to Donna, just for being Donna. She is my strength, my source, my reason to get up every day. There are other folks at the station where I record this, leading off with Will McKinnon, cameraman and video editor extraordinaire of Song and Fable. Then there is, or are more properly, Chris, Ivana, and Dylan, who keep things moving around here with their youthful energy and can amazingly, even occasionally, make this old fart feel like a member of the gang. And then there's Rich Goulart, executive director and all-around go-to guy here, who is prepared to take a chance on me. So when I first approached him about doing a weekly show of political commentary, which I flippantly described as a lefty Glenn Beck minus the chalkboard and paranoia, I could tell he wasn't sure it wouldn't peter out after a few weeks. But he took the chance and let me do it my way, and I hope he's had cause to be happy with his decision. And finally, I want to thank not a person but a concept, public access television. You're watching me on TV right now, unless you're seeing this on YouTube, of course. But yes, it's TV, but it's special. It's public access TV, also called community access, cable access, whatever. But whatever you call it, it's public access TV. Involves providing equipment, training, and airtime so that members of the general public can present programming to the audience of that cable TV system, and potentially far beyond. In fact, this show is seen, so far as I'm aware, in about 4 or 5 different stations in different states, with a combined subscriber base in excess of 50,000, which means hypothetically, what I say could be seen and heard in 50,000 households. Now, I'm just an ordinary schlub. I remember what Eric Burden, what do you call himself in this song? An overfed, long-haired, leaping gnome. And, but still, despite that, there are potentially thousands of people listening to what I have to say. It's public access TV that makes that possible. You're watching one of those channels now. This is public access TV. Public access TV, that means it's for all of us, including you. I took advantage of it. You should too. Go to your local access station. Let me finish up by thanking those of you who watched the show and those of you who have commented on it. Thank you for taking the time. I look forward to more comments, and I look forward to hopefully making a show worth watching. Let me know how I do. For now, that's it. Remember, we take the last week of the month off, so we will actually be seeing the first week of May is when the next show will be. So as of now, just for this time, you have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. And in the meantime, as always, peace.